The Founders of DeepL and the Rise of an Age. Cologne, Germany, winter, 2016. The Rhine was a strip of black glass under a white sky, the city hushed under new snow. In a three-story building set back from the riverbank, where most windows were dark except for one glowing rectangle on the top floor, a man sat alone with a looping neural network visualization drifting across his monitor. Yaroslav Kudalowski leaned closer to the screen, eyes narrowed as if trying to will the model to reveal its secrets. For months, he had barely slept. Coffee cups formed a neat, accidental architecture around his keyboard. The office's cleaning staff joked that he lived there. His colleagues suspected it might be true. He knew what he was building. He did not yet know how far it would go. Behind him, a whiteboard was filled with sketches that only a few people on Earth could interpret. Matrix multiplications, attention layer experiments, prototypes of what he called semantic depth heuristics, a concept that seemed to move beyond translation into something more existential, understanding. The room hummed gently with GPU fans, their soft mechanical breath echoing back at him like a choir of quiet machines. Yaroslav pressed enter. The model's evaluation results scrolled across the screen. And everything changed. A quiet gasp escaped him, not loud enough for the empty building to hear, but powerful enough to alter the course of his life. The translation wasn't just accurate. It wasn't just improved. It was alive. Every researcher in machine translation knew this feeling, the moment when the model stops sounding like a machine and starts sounding like a mind. But this was beyond even the benchmarks of Google and Microsoft at the time. He whispered, barely audible, "Yes, ist möglich. It is possible." He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He only stared, stunned, as if looking at the first faint spark of a star newly born. Tonight, the revolution had begun, but the world did not know it yet. Only he did. And the river outside kept flowing, indifferent, silent. Years earlier, long before the world spoke the name DeepL, Yaroslav's story began not in a glossy startup office, but in the intellectual tumult of German academia. He was born in Poland, but educated in Germany, drawn early into the gravitational pull of mathematics. His professors recalled him not as a prodigy, though he was, but as a challenger, a thinker who argued with problems until they surrendered. A classmate once joked, "If you give Yarek a wall, he doesn't walk around it. He talks the wall into moving." He fell in love with puzzles, models, structures, the hidden architecture beneath language and logic. At the University of Heidelberg, he immersed himself deeply in computational linguistics and machine learning before deep learning existed as popular jargon. Neural networks were still niche, almost fringe. Funding was scarce. Recognition even scarcer. But he didn't need recognition. He needed possibility. Years later, colleagues would say Yarek never worked for accolades. He worked for the beauty of systems, the elegance of intelligent structure. And language, he discovered, was the most chaotic and beautiful system of all. It was a living organism, inconsistent, rebellious, untamable. But he believed he could build something that understood it. Not word by word. Not dictionary by dictionary. But thought by thought. Before DeepL, there was Lingi, a company built quietly, methodically, far from Silicon Valley's theatrics. Lingi's search engine for bilingual texts became beloved by translators worldwide, a secret tool of professionals, students, and diplomats. But behind the scenes, the team felt something larger on the horizon. The founding team, mathematicians, linguists, physicists, engineering wizards, shared a rare vision. Not just to catalog language, not just to index it, but to interpret it the way humans do. When Yaroslav joined the company's leadership, the team gained a mind who could turn that long-shot dream into a technical roadmap. He and the founders held meetings in cramped rooms lit by old fluorescent bulbs, surrounded by war room scribbles. Context over literal. Semantic field mapping. Attention equals meaning priority. The soul of a sentence is not grammar, it is intention. They argued. They debated. They obsessed. One engineer later described it. It felt like we were building a telescope aimed not at the stars, but at human thought. Not one person in those rooms believed they were just building a translation engine. They were building a bridge, a quiet bridge across the fractured world. And the blueprint of that bridge lived inside Yaroslav's mind. December 2017. The prototype had developed beyond their expectations. Benchmarks whispered of superiority. Early tests showed astonishing fluency. But none of that mattered unless the world agreed. In the final days before launch, the office was a war zone of sleeplessness. Empty pizza boxes, overused espresso machines, engineers with dark circles beneath their eyes. The final evaluations came in. DeepL translated a legal paragraph and read like a lawyer. A poem and kept the rhythm. A philosophical passage and preserved nuance. A French linguist gasped aloud. It feels like this system thinks. News quietly leaked among experts. Skeptics scoffed. A small German company beating Google? Impossible. Then the tests went public. DeepL outperformed every major translation system in blind evaluations across Europe. The industry didn't explode. It froze. Silence. Then shock. Then realization. The world had expected the next leap in AI translation to come from Silicon Valley. Instead, it came from a focused, relentless team in Cologne who had quietly built a model that felt fundamentally different. Google engineers whispered, "Have you tested the German startup's model? It's unsettling." Microsoft researchers muttered, "They've built something we didn't anticipate." And translators everywhere asked the same thing. Where did this come from? Against all expectations, DeepL did not go public. Did not boast. Did not seek glory. They improved. Quietly. Constantly. Almost obsessively. Yaroslav guided the team with a philosophy that became legendary. The product speaks. We do not. DeepL Pro launched. Enterprise licensing followed. Fortune 500 companies integrated DeepL into global operations. Revenue surged. But inside the company, you would never know. There were no victory parades. Just whiteboards. And models. And the pursuit of precision. One employee described working under Yaroslav like this. Imagine trying to catch smoke with your hands. That's what it feels like to chase his vision. He pushed not because he wanted to dominate the market, but because the work was beautiful. Because the world deserved translation that felt human. Invisible. Effortless. Understanding without labor. A miracle disguised as software. But the higher DeepL climbed, the more Yarek felt a new pressure gnawing at him. The world was changing rapidly, dangerously. AI models were no longer simple tools. They were turning into civilization infrastructure. Translation was not a toy. It was the bloodstream of global communication. A mistranslated word could break business deals. A mistranslated phrase could spark diplomatic tension. The responsibility was immense. Yaroslav often stayed late, alone in the dim office, thinking about things far beyond neural networks. How does an AI model shape culture? Whose voice does it amplify? Whose identity does it distort? In a journal, he once wrote, "When you build a system that understands language, you are building a system that understands humans." And that is not a responsibility one can take lightly. He feared a world where translation became a weapon. A world where machines decided what words should mean. And he vowed DeepL would never drift into that darkness. DeepL's public benchmark victory spread like wildfire through research circles, but in the halls of the largest AI labs in the world, the news hit like a tremor. In Mountain View, a Google Brain researcher stared at the internal evaluation report in disbelief. This can't be right. Across the ocean, at Microsoft's Redmond campus, another engineer leaned back in her chair and whispered, "Who the hell is DeepL?" They reran tests, rechecked datasets, scanned for bugs. But the results were consistent. DeepL wasn't just competitive. It was ahead, and not by small margins. Across Europe, within government offices tasked with translation and diplomatic communication, a similar realization began to take hold. A small German company had overtaken the American giants. And they had done it without billions in compute, without an army of researchers, without the Silicon Valley spotlight. They did it with focus, purity of intention, and a culture that worshipped linguistic excellence above all else. Soon, offers began to circulate, quiet inquiries for acquisition, whispers from tech giants, soft probes from investors, tentative approaches from governments who wanted exclusive access. But Yaroslav was unmoved. He told his board, "If we join a giant, we lose our soul. If we stay independent, we shape the future." The team agreed. DeepL would remain a private, independent guardian of understanding, and the world would soon learn what that meant. While rivals scrambled to replicate their results, DeepL's research team was already redefining the problem. Translation was not an endpoint. It was a gateway. How do humans understand the meaning of text became the central question. Not, how do we map words between languages? Inside DeepL's hidden research wing, a minimalist room with white walls, dim warm lighting, and a permanent scent of coffee, the team began experimenting with models that could interpret intentions, detect tone and emotional shading, identify formal versus colloquial nuance, interpret cultural connotations, restructure entire paragraphs for readability. This was no longer translation. This was cognitive interpretation. One researcher described it as trying to teach the model empathy. Human language was not literal. It was layered, pragmatic, emotional, ambiguous, playful, contradictory. DeepL's new architecture needed to reflect that. So Yaroslav pushed a radical proposal. A model that moved beyond linear sequence-to-sequence translation. A model that internally reconstructed meaning as a flexible semantic cloud, reorganizing words not in order of appearance, but in order of conceptual weight. His diagram looked like artwork, swirling clusters of meaning, threads interlinking like constellations. A junior engineer squinted at the whiteboard and murmured, "This is insane." Yaroslav smiled slightly. "Yes, but if we succeed, it will feel natural, not insane." That was the essence of DeepL. To hide impossible complexity beneath effortless usage. No one should feel the machinery, only the clarity. Success whispered loudly. Competitors restructured entire teams to chase DeepL's breakthroughs. Millions were poured into new training pipelines. A few companies even replicated DeepL's user interface pixel by pixel. But DeepL refused to be distracted. They didn't chase trends. They didn't rush features. They didn't expand recklessly. When investors pushed for aggressive global marketing, Yaroslav shook his head. "Our brand is quality, not noise." He believed trust was built not by advertising, but by consistency. The translation world became split into two camps. The fast builders, tech giants with massive compute, racing for dominance, pushing updates weekly. DeepL, honing every nuance until it was nearly perfect. The rivalry was intense but unspoken. A Google researcher privately admitted, "We hate competing with DeepL. They don't behave like a tech company. They behave like artisans. And artisans are hard to beat." DeepL's users didn't merely switch platforms, they pledged allegiance. Because DeepL wasn't a tool. It was a companion. DeepL Pro was only the beginning. Soon, global corporations realized that translation wasn't a convenience, it was operational infrastructure. Multinational logistics companies used DeepL to coordinate global shipments. Pharmaceutical companies used it to translate clinical data. Law firms used it to draft contracts across borders. European parliaments used it to create multilingual briefings. The subscription numbers grew into the millions. Enterprise contracts expanded. Revenue surged. And through it all, the company remained almost bizarrely humble. No flashy headquarters. No massive employee count. No Silicon Valley theatrics or influencer-style announcements. DeepL simply delivered excellence. An investor once joked, DeepL is the least hype-driven unicorn in Europe. But that minimalism was its strength. Yaroslav often told his team, hype fades, precision endures. The company's value grew into the billions. Founders and early employees saw their equity multiply. But the culture never changed. Work quietly. Build honestly. Elevate understanding. In late 2020, DeepL began testing a new architecture internally referred to as Project Lumen. It was a gamble. A redesign so radical that half the team believed it wouldn't work. Instead of analyzing sentences as streams of tokens, Lumen attempted to model concept symmetries across languages, the idea that certain meanings existed in multiple linguistic worlds simultaneously, connected by mental equivalences rather than grammar. It was like building a map not of language, but of thought. During a heated meeting, one engineer objected, "We're breaking too far from known architectures. If this fails, we lose a year." Yaroslav replied calmly, "If this succeeds, we gain a decade." Silence filled the room. Then they built it. Training took weeks. The compute bill was staggering. But the results were unlike anything they'd ever seen. A French poem translated into Japanese retained its emotional cadence. A German legal argument translated into Portuguese preserved its logic flawlessly. A Korean personal note translated into English sounded genuinely heartfelt, not mechanical. It was miraculous. And terrifying. A senior linguist murmured, "What have we created?" No one answered. Some questions were too large for immediate answers. As DeepL grew, journalists began asking Yaroslav for interviews. He declined almost all of them. He spoke rarely in public, but when he did, his words revealed a core philosophy that shaped DeepL's culture. "I don't believe language divides us. I believe misunderstanding divides us." He saw translation not as an industry, but as a moral undertaking. The world was fractured. Misinformation, cultural tension, nationalism versus globalization, social media polarization. And at the root of all of it lay communication, or the failure of it. When asked why DeepL refused to sell to bigger companies, he replied, "Because language is too important to belong to a monopoly." That belief guided every decision. DeepL was not merely a business. It was a quiet force of cohesion. But with every success came risk. By 2022, large language models exploded onto the global scene. Foundation models shifted from narrow task systems to general-purpose reasoning engines. Suddenly, translation was no longer a specialized domain. It was one of 1,000 tasks that massive AI models could perform. Competitors weren't just tech giants anymore. They were the largest AI models ever created. Systems trained on trillions of tokens. Models that could write essays, code programs, draft legal documents, generate stories, answer complex questions. And among those abilities was translation, fast, free, and integrated everywhere. A DeepL engineer stared at a competitor's demo and whispered, "If this continues, translation becomes a commodity." Inside DeepL, anxiety spread. For the first time, the team felt pressure not from rivals, but from the future itself. The company stood at a crossroads. Should they pivot beyond translation? Should they expand into general AI? Or remain true to the craft? Yaroslav gathered the team for an all-hands meeting rare enough that employees sensed something momentous. He stood before them, hands clasped, eyes resolute. "We do not chase trends. We lead quietly. And we stay loyal to our mission." Then he added, "The world does not need another model that can do everything. It needs a model that can do one thing with absolute excellence." Silence fell. Then applause. DeepL would not abandon its identity. They would double down on what made them unique. Understanding. By 2023, the world had entered a new information order. Language was no longer a barrier, it was a medium of instantaneous transformation. Text flowed across borders like light, and meaning traveled farther and faster than cargo ships, planes, or satellites. DeepL watched this transformation from a vantage point of quiet influence. Its translation shaped international trade negotiations, cross-border emergency responses, diplomatic briefings, global scientific collaboration, millions of personal conversations across cultures. A Japanese biologist once wrote to the company, "Your tool allowed me to publish in English. It changed my life." An Italian hospital administrator said, "We used DeepL to coordinate with German suppliers during COVID. We could not have operated otherwise." Countless stories flowed in, stories of connection, survival, opportunity, understanding. DeepL had not set out to change the world, but it had. And with influence came a new kind of weight. Tech giants expanded rapidly. Massive AI models became cultural phenomena. Virtual assistants evolved into quasi-companions. Search engines became conversational. Programming assistants began replacing junior developers. The AI race grew feverish, chaotic, desperate. Companies bragged about parameter counts, training flops, trillion token datasets, emergent behaviors, benchmark domination. But DeepL did not boast, did not compete, did not escalate. Instead, DeepL doubled down on three principles. Language was sacred. Its integrity mattered. DeepL did not become a chatbot, did not become an everything model, did not chase virality. Quality over spectacle, depth over breadth. A senior engineer later said, "Everyone else was trying to conquer the world. DeepL was just trying to understand it." This philosophy, paradoxically, became their strength. While other models drowned in hallucinations, DeepL remained sober, reliable, meticulously faithful to meaning. This reliability became a differentiator so strong that enterprises never left. Law firms, banks, governments, they needed accuracy, not entertainment. And accuracy had a name: DeepL. 3. The model that understood silence. Near the end of 2023, Yaroslav proposed a project that startled even his closest collaborators. Language exists not only in words, he said, but in what is between them. He wanted DeepL to understand implied meaning, cultural subtext, emotional shading, politeness and indirectness, nuance that could not be explicitly stated, the silence between sentences. In the research room, he drew a diagram. Words, sentences, paragraphs, subtext. The team stared at it. One linguist said, "We can't model subtext. Subtext is human." Yaroslav looked at her calmly. "So is translation." Project Substrata was born. The model was trained not only on text, but on linguistic behavior patterns, how people implied things, how cultures softened blows, how languages handled confrontation or humility. Testing Substrata was uncanny. A blunt English sentence translated into Japanese became suitably indirect. A formal German message translated into Spanish gained warmth and courtesy. A sarcastic French remark carried tone into English without losing sharpness. One engineer whispered, "It doesn't just translate. It reads the room." The leap was astonishing and unsettling. For the first time, DeepL's models brushed against the edge of true linguistic intelligence, the understanding that communication was not factual, but social. And with that realization came a deeper responsibility. Success brought attention. Attention brought imitation. Imitation brought regulation. Governments began scrutinizing AI translation for bias, political influence, cultural distortion, misinformation, ideological framing. A parliamentary hearing in Brussels asked, "What happens when a translation engine becomes the gatekeeper of meaning?" Yaroslav understood the gravity. DeepL was used by millions of students, workers, diplomats, ministers, scientists. A flawed translation could change a decision. A biased translation could tilt public opinion. And so, DeepL took a stand. They implemented rigorous bias evaluation, multilingual oversight committees, cultural sensitivity modeling, transparency reports, internal ethics review for every major architectural change. Some investors complained, but Yaroslav only answered, accuracy is a moral choice, and moral choices define DeepL's identity. While consumer markets fluctuated, enterprise adoption exploded. DeepL Enterprise became the backbone of global banks, regulatory documents, pharmaceutical giants, clinical reports, logistics firms routing customs, law firms, cross-border litigation, publishers, international editions, manufacturers, technical manuals. Companies once spent thousands of employee hours on translation workflows. With DeepL, those hours became minutes. One CTO put it bluntly, it didn't just speed up our work. It rewired our company. And with enterprise subscriptions priced at a premium, DeepL's revenue soared. Predictable, recurring, global, essential. Founders and early employees watched their equity multiply. A private valuation in the billions was now conservative. But inside the company, nothing changed. The coffee remained terrible. The offices remained modest. The whiteboards remained full. DeepL's culture was its fortress and its secret weapon. But perfection is not without cost. By late 2024, the team faced burnout. Some had not taken holidays in years. Others felt the weight of responsibility growing unbearable. One senior engineer left a note on Yaroslav's desk. We are building something extraordinary. But extraordinary things are heavy. Yaroslav read the letter 3 times. He realized he had driven his team with the same relentless intensity he applied to himself. He had assumed they shared his stamina. But they were human and needed care, balance, rest. The next day, he addressed the entire company. His voice was quiet but steady. I have pushed too hard. You are not machines. You are the reason DeepL exists. I failed to protect that. Then he made a decision that shocked everyone. The company would adopt an enforced rest cycle, mandatory breaks for the research team, rotational scheduling, protected mental health weeks, and strict work-hour limits. Some investors protested again. But the team? The team wept. DeepL survived because its people did. And Yaroslav vowed never to forget that truth again. In early 2025, DeepL deployed a model that would redefine its place in history. DeepL Interpretation Engine, a system designed to go beyond language and enter the realm of contextual cognition. It could summarize foreign documents with cultural accuracy, rewrite text for specific audiences, adjust tone and formality for local expectations, maintain factual fidelity even across linguistic gaps, integrate multimodal understanding, document plus text plus structure. And most astonishingly, it could restructure an idea, not just a sentence. A Brazilian business pitch adapted to German expectations gained precision. An English scientific paper rewritten for French academics gained elegance. A Spanish political speech translated into Japanese gained appropriate restraint. This was no longer translation. This was thought transformation. A linguist reviewing the system whispered, "We've entered a new age." And she was right. DeepL had created tools not of language, but of understanding. Tools that would quietly shape global communication for decades. Tools that would outlive geopolitics, industries, and even the founders themselves. With every breakthrough, Yaroslav felt something shifting inside him. Pride, yes, but also fear. DeepL had become a force that shaped diplomacy, business restructuring, scientific discovery, cross-cultural understanding, international trust. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. Late at night, alone in the office, he often stared at the city lights and wondered, what is the cost of empowering meaning? A mistranslation could break a company. A nuanced shift could alter sentiment. A subtle tone change could distort intent. He realized DeepL was more than software. It was the hidden architecture beneath global communication. A silent participant in shaping dialogue between nations, between cultures, between people. And he sat at the helm of that responsibility like a solitary captain steering a ship through fog. One evening, after a 12-hour meeting on enterprise security and model safeguards, Yaroslav walked outside. Snow drifted softly across Cologne. The sky glowed orange from the city lights. He saw a young couple standing on the bridge over the Rhine. The woman spoke Japanese, the man German, both haltingly trying to communicate with each other using DeepL on their phone, laughing every time it misunderstood their flirting. Yaroslav stopped walking. He watched them, two strangers from different worlds, finding common ground through the thing he had built. Not corporations. Not governments. Not billion-dollar contracts. Just people. Communicating. Connecting. Laughing. He felt something inside him loosen, a quiet relief, a softening. This, he realized, was the heart of DeepL. Not the models. Not the research papers. Not the benchmarks. Not the revenue. But the spark of understanding between human beings. And on that snowy bridge, he felt something like peace. The rain had finally stopped over Cologne. The pavements still glistened, reflecting the quiet amber glow of street lamps stretching along the riverfront. Deep inside an office overlooking the Rhine, the last lights remained on not because a deadline loomed, nor because the company was in crisis, but because the founders of DeepL had slipped into one of their late-night rituals, an earnest conversation about meaning, intelligence, and the future they were shaping. Yaroslav Kudalowski stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching droplets slide slowly down the glass. Behind him, faint keyboard clicks whispered through the room as engineers ran experiments long after most of the city had gone to sleep. The sounds were familiar, almost comforting. He wasn't thinking about valuations. Not investors. Not market share. Not competition. He was thinking, as he increasingly did in those late hours, about language itself. Meaning, he murmured softly to no one, is the last frontier. There was a time when the goal had been simple: build a translator that feels like a human wrote it. But after years at the edge of machine understanding, and after DeepL had become a global phenomenon, the horizon had shifted. It wasn't about translation anymore. It was about understanding. And understanding was a heavier responsibility than it sounded. When Yaroslav spoke at conferences, people expected him to talk about neural nets, model architecture, and GPU scaling curves. They expected diagrams and equations. But he rarely started there. Instead, he liked to ask, what is a sentence? Not the grammar school answer, a unit of language expressing a complete thought, but a deeper, more unsettling one. A sentence was a window into a person's mind. A sentence carried cultural context, emotional weight, unspoken assumptions, humor, fear, nuance, intent. To translate a sentence was to walk a tightrope between universes. To do it right, a model needed more than parameters. It needed a philosophy. One misplaced word, he often said, can shift meaning like a tectonic plate. This belief guided DeepL's engineering culture. They were meticulous. They were obsessive. They chased microshades of nuance that most users would never consciously notice, the difference between ironic and sarcastic, urgent and pressing, resigned and defeated. The world saw DeepL as a product. The team saw it as a living hypothesis. Can a machine ever truly grasp intent? By the early 2020s, DeepL was no longer just a translator. It had become infrastructure. Diplomats used it for negotiations. Researchers used it to read papers across borders. Doctors used it to comfort patients. Refugees used it to speak to governments. Corporations used it to bridge continents. Translation was not a feature. Translation was a power. And power always carried weight. One night, a senior engineer approached Yaroslav quietly. We found a political term that shifts tone depending on region. If we normalize it, some groups will accuse us of bias. If we maintain local connotations, others will accuse us of bias in the opposite direction. Yaroslav closed his eyes for a moment. His voice was soft. Meaning isn't neutral. But our responsibility is clarity, not persuasion. He believed this deeply, not because it was good PR, not because it was expected, but because machines that shaped language were shaping cognition. The team often joked that DeepL wasn't a tech company, it was a philosophy department accidentally attached to a neural network lab. And when the world began relying on their translations, the line between engineering and ethics blurred. What if a translation affects a legal decision? What about misinformation campaigns that exploit linguistic gaps? What if automated understanding becomes a platform for manipulation? These weren't theoretical questions. They were weekly ones. DeepL had to build guardrails not just for accuracy, but for humanity. Many assumed DeepL would eventually IPO. Some assumed they would sell to a tech giant. Others assumed they would balloon into a trillion-dollar AI conglomerate. But DeepL stayed private, quiet, focused. The founders were not chasing valuation headlines. They were chasing something far more elusive: purity of mission. So many companies lose their soul, said one early employee, recalling the internal meeting where they decided to remain independent. Yaroslav wanted freedom, the freedom to prioritize linguistic truth over financial optics. This decision surprised many. But DeepL was profitable, subscription-driven, and deeply trusted by enterprises. Independence was not a rebellion, it was a commitment. The investors who stayed understood that their return was tied to a company guided not by hype cycles, but by a philosophy rarely seen in the AI industry. Do one thing better than anyone in the world, and keep improving it. Like all builders who touched the raw frontier of AI, the founders carried fears they rarely voiced publicly. Late at night, Yaroslav confessed some of them to the team. He feared a world where machines generated language so fluidly that people stopped thinking deeply. He feared that mistranslations, even rare ones, could ripple into diplomatic incidents or societal divides. He feared that as AI models grew larger, they might lose the crisp human-like texture that made DeepL special. But perhaps his deepest fear was, will people always remember the value of language when machines can do the speaking for them? He knew technology often made things easier, but ease could dull meaning. Language was not just a bridge. It was identity. It was culture. It was memory. It was human struggle made audible. He feared losing that. And so, the team embedded cultural preservation into their model training. They fought aggressively to keep regional idioms alive. They refused to flatten expressive uniqueness into statistical blandness. DeepL did not want to erase difference. It wanted to celebrate it. By the mid-2030s, DeepL's influence had deepened in ways no one had predicted. Anthropologists used it to revive endangered languages. Archivists used it to decode ancient scripts. Musicians used it to translate lyrics without losing soul. Poets, yes, even poets, used it as a sparring partner to refine rhythm and metaphor. The founders found themselves invited to gatherings they never imagined: linguistic congresses, philosophical symposiums, cultural preservation summits. Ambassadors, historians, educators, indigenous leaders, all wanted the same thing: a future where intelligence amplifies meaning, not replaces it. DeepL's models grew not only more accurate but more self-reflective. They learned to express uncertainty. They asked clarifying questions. They avoided assumptions. They understood that ambiguity could be intentional, even beautiful. The founders realized something profound. Understanding is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is the respectful navigation of it. That became the company's unofficial credo. On a crisp winter morning, snow drifting lightly over the river, Yaroslav walked alone along the Hohenzollern Bridge. Locks placed by lovers shimmered with frost. The train tracks hummed quietly nearby. He paused at the midpoint, overlooking the water. Somewhere behind him, DeepL servers were processing millions of sentences, confessions, arguments, dreams, negotiations, diary entries, business strategies, apologies, declarations of love. Millions of human moments. Translated. Transformed. Connected. A bridge. Not made of steel, but of meaning. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint whispers of dozens of languages being translated at that very second. Some elegant, some messy, some joyous, some aching. Humanity in chorus. And he smiled because he realized something. DeepL was not a product. It was not even a company. It was a promise. That every voice deserves to be understood. He placed his hand on the cold railing, letting the enormity of that promise settle into him. The future of translation intelligence would be more complex than any model they had built so far. More ethical questions. More cultural dilemmas. More philosophical puzzles. More frontiers. But he felt no fear now. Only responsibility. And purpose. Behind him, the city stirred awake. Ahead of him, the river carried the sunrise across its surface like a ribbon of light. Yaroslav murmured something to himself, a line he had repeated many times throughout the journey. Understanding each other is the first step toward understanding ourselves. Then he turned back toward the DeepL office, shoes crunching softly on the frosted walkway, ready to build the next chapter of a world that could finally speak to itself and be heard.